General William A. Thompson stood tall in the crowded airport terminal, the crisp sound of his polished boots echoing against the smooth marble floors. His military uniform, adorned with countless medals and patches, seemed to reflect not only his achievements, but also the weight of his years in service. Years spent leading men and making life or death decisions. He was in his mid-40s, tall and commanding, but his eyes, though sharp and focused, revealed the quiet fatigue of someone who had seen too much. He moved through the bustling airport with purpose, yet there was an air of solitude around him, as though he existed in a different world from those around him. People walked past, their eyes darting in his direction, some with curiosity, others with fleeting recognition, but none dared to stop. In the vast, impersonal space of the terminal, Thompson was just another face in the crowd. As he approached the check-in counter, the noise of the terminal seemed to fade into the background, the rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights overhead filling the silence between him and the young attendant behind the desk. Despite the hurried bustle of travelers, an unsettling stillness clung to the moment, an unease that hadn't been there before, an instinctual feeling that something was about to unfold. The young attendant, David, glanced at General Thompson's ticket with a practiced smile, but there was something in his eyes, something subtle, almost imperceptible, that shifted the atmosphere. Thompson noticed it immediately. David hesitated, his fingers pausing over the keyboard as if unsure how to proceed. It wasn't the usual warmth one might expect at a customer service counter, where politeness flows smoothly and the transaction is a simple exchange of pleasantries. Instead, there was an air of tension that lingered between them, like a crack in the surface of a calm pond. David's eyes flicked up briefly, then back down to the ticket, as though confirming it one last time. The slight frown on his face deepened and his posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly, as though he was trying to read the general without meeting his gaze fully. There was a moment of silence between them, filled only with the low murmur of conversations and the occasional announcement over the intercom. The polite smile on David's face grew faintly forced, and his voice, when it finally came, was a touch too loud, almost too bright, as if to cover the discomfort bubbling just below the surface. "Good afternoon, sir. May I have your ticket and identification?" David asked, his words quick, as if hoping to move past the encounter as fast as possible, as if to distance himself from whatever unease had settled in the air. Thompson, familiar with the drill, handed over his ticket and identification without hesitation, his movements smooth and deliberate. The uniform he wore wasn't just for show, it was a symbol of his rank, his accomplishments, his sacrifice. He was a man who had earned his place, fought for it through years of dedication and battle. Yet something in David's eyes suggested otherwise. The attendant's fingers tapped the desk as he glanced at the ticket once again, his expression shifting. A brief flicker of discomfort crossing his face before it was quickly masked by another forced smile. David's gaze flicked to the side, looking over Thompson's uniform as though searching for an explanation that would make sense, a reason to reconcile what he saw with what he expected. It wasn't the first time Thompson had encountered such scrutiny, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. David looked back at Thompson, his eyes now narrowed just slightly, a hint of suspicion creeping into the way he studied him. "I'm afraid, sir," David began, his tone suddenly shifting to something more mechanical, more rehearsed. "You'll need to wait. First-class seating is only available to select passengers. I'll need to check with my supervisor to verify your status." The words hit Thompson like a slap to the face, sharp and sudden. The attendant's words were professional, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of something else, an implication, a judgment, that carried more weight than the words themselves. The flicker of disbelief in David's eyes had become a quiet assumption, as if to say that a man like Thompson, dressed in his military uniform, couldn't possibly belong in first class. The reaction wasn't subtle, and it wasn't an accident. Thompson's fingers tightened slightly around his ticket, his pulse quickening ever so slightly, but he held his ground, his expression impassive, though the muscles in his jaw clenched ever so slightly. He knew the drill. He'd been through countless bureaucratic hurdles before, but this time something felt different. The air felt heavier, as if David's dismissal of him wasn't just about the logistics of a seating arrangement. It was something deeper, more ingrained, something rooted in his very presence. I'm a, I'm a first-class passenger, Thompson replied, his voice firm yet controlled, but a hint of tension now threading through it. It's on my ticket. There's no mistake. David looked at the ticket again, his eyes scanning the information with almost exaggerated care before they returned to Thompson's face. This time there was no attempt at polite deflection. David's gaze flicked to the side again, and his fingers hesitated over the keyboard, as though confirming that the name and the rank before him were indeed legitimate. His expression, briefly frozen in disbelief, shifted again. This time, frustration mingled with the unease. It was a hesitation that lingered far too long for a simple check-in, and as David's gaze returned to Thompson's face, it was as if he was trying to make sense of the man standing before him. A general, someone who had undoubtedly fought for his country, seen horrors most people could never imagine. But in this moment, David couldn't seem to reconcile that with the image of the man standing before him, a black man in military garb, claiming his place in a space where people like him didn't usually belong. "I'll have to call my supervisor, sir," David said, his voice now carrying a slight dismissiveness, though it was tempered with a thin veneer of professionalism. "Please, just wait here." Thompson nodded, though the action felt mechanical, more of a gesture than anything else. He stepped aside, watching, as David fumbled for the phone, muttering something under his breath as he dialed. The minutes dragged on as Thompson stood there, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He could feel the eyes of those around him, the curious glances, the sidelong stares, the whispers just beyond hearing. Some of them were glancing at him with fleeting recognition, others with a look of something more familiar, something that echoed in his chest. The look of a man who had been seen before, but only for his uniform, only for the status it carried. He remained still, his face a mask of quiet resolve. His mind, however, was a whirl of thoughts, flashes of moments from his past, times when his presence had been questioned, his authority dismissed, all because of the color of his skin, all because of the assumptions people made, the boxes they wanted to put him in. As the minutes stretched on, the supervisor arrived. Karen, mid-40s, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. She wore the uniform of the airline with an air of authority, her steps sharp and purposeful. The faintest trace of impatience lingered in the set of her jaw. But there was also something else, something that spoke of experience, of dealing with difficult passengers, of handling confrontations just like this one. She exchanged a brief glance with David before turning her attention fully to Thompson, her gaze running over him with a kind of hesitant skepticism. The moment felt rehearsed, like she'd dealt with these types of situations before, but the tension was different now. The scrutiny wasn't just on his ticket, it was on him, on his very presence. And for a brief moment, Thompson couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to figure out whether he belonged in this space at all. He could see it in her eyes, that flicker of disbelief, as if she couldn't quite reconcile what she saw with what she expected. Karen's arrival brought a brief, sharp shift in the atmosphere, but it didn't clear the tension that hung in the air like a storm cloud. She didn't immediately offer an apology, nor did she seem surprised by the situation. Instead, she glanced at Thompson with that same calculating look that had been present in David's eyes. She was taking him in, examining him as if she were weighing a decision. It was a moment Thompson had become all too familiar with, a moment when someone sees more than just his military rank, when they don't just see the years of service, the medals, or the uniform. They see something else. They see a man who doesn't belong. He could feel the eyes of the surrounding passengers on him, their gazes shifting between Karen and himself, lingering just a bit too long. The undercurrent of judgment in the air was palpable, even in the stillness of the terminal. He could see them just out of the corner of his eye. A middle-aged couple, their faces set in quiet confusion. A young man with headphones who was looking intently at his phone, but whose eyes kept darting back toward Thompson, as though wondering why this was taking so long. Then there were the older travelers, those who probably had never seen a black man in first class, who were certainly unfamiliar with a figure like him. The scrutiny was more than just uncomfortable, it was suffocating. "General," Karen said, her voice warm, but there was an edge that made it feel more like a statement than a greeting. I see you're all set for first class, but we're going to have to verify a few things before we can allow you to board. She didn't specify what needed verification. She didn't have to. Thompson knew exactly what she was implying. She wasn't questioning his ticket. She wasn't even questioning his status as a general. What she was really questioning was his right to occupy the space he had already been assigned. It was a familiar feeling, one that dug deep and scraped at his pride. It was the feeling of being out of place, even in a place where you belonged. It was the unmistakable sting of racial profiling, a sting that had been a constant throughout his life, no matter how far he'd risen in the ranks. He could feel his pulse quicken, but he didn't let it show. His years in the military had taught him how to control his emotions, how to mask his frustrations and keep his composure. But this wasn't just about a uniform. It was personal. The way Karen was looking at him, the way she stood slightly too far from him, as though trying to distance herself, all of it screamed something he had seen time and again. Doubt, discomfort, and the deep-seated belief that people like him didn't belong in places like this. He stood tall, his back straight, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked with hers, not in anger, but with a silent resolve that spoke volumes. "Are you suggesting there's a mistake with my booking?" he asked, his voice calm, though there was an edge to it now, a firmness that hadn't been there before. Karen hesitated. There was no denying the question was loaded, and she seemed to realize the gravity of what she was about to say. She glanced at David, who was now standing a few feet away, anxiously glancing between them, his fingers still tapping on the counter. David, who had made the initial judgment, who had assumed that Thompson wasn't supposed to be in first class. It was all hanging in the air now, the weight of that unspoken question. How would Karen handle it? "Well, it's just procedure," Karen finally said, her voice softening slightly, but there was still a sense of distance in her words. "We just need to make sure everything checks out before we allow any further boarding. I'm sure you understand." "I don't understand," Thompson replied sharply, the words escaping before he could hold them back. His frustration, which he had kept simmering beneath the surface, was now beginning to bubble over. His hands clenched at his sides, but he quickly unclenched them, forcing himself to remain controlled. The last thing he wanted was to lose his temper here, in front of all these people. David shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the other passengers, his eyes darting from Thompson to the supervisors, as if waiting for the conflict to settle. Karen, too, seemed uneasy, though she remained composed outwardly. But Thompson could sense the tension building, the invisible line being drawn tighter between them. And it wasn't just about the flight anymore. It was about something far more profound. It was about dignity. It was about respect. And it was about whether or not they would treat him, as a man, the same way they would treat any other paying customer in first class. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours, and Thompson felt the eyes of the people around him pressing in closer, their silent judgment building with every passing moment. He knew they were watching, silently weighing him, making assumptions about who he was, about what he deserved. The sense of alienation grew stronger with each breath, and as the silence lingered, Thompson began to wonder if this had all been a setup, a deliberate attempt to challenge him, to make him prove himself once again. A voice, small but clear, cut through the tension. It was a woman sitting near the front of the line, her voice slightly shaking but firm. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her eyes narrowing, scanning the scene. Thompson turned to look at her, grateful for the interruption. But he couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness. The woman, clearly in her early 30s, appeared to be well-dressed, an executive type perhaps, someone who had probably never faced the scrutiny he had. She wasn't looking at him with sympathy or even empathy. There was no warmth in her expression. She wasn't defending him as much as she was trying to understand what had taken so long. "Just following protocol, ma'am," Karen replied, her voice still polite, though it now carried the unmistakable tension of a woman who was trying to maintain control of a situation she couldn't quite handle. The woman raised an eyebrow, her posture stiffening. "So, you're questioning his ticket? Because I don't see a problem here." The underlying challenge in her voice hung in the air for a moment, and for a second Thompson thought she might be on his side. But then Karen's response deflated the tension, her voice dripping with a thin veneer of authority that was meant to end the conversation. "No, not at all. We just need to confirm, that's all." Thompson looked back at the woman, the confusion still etched on her face, and then he saw it, the subtle flicker of realization in her eyes. She wasn't questioning the validity of the situation. She was just processing it, the way so many people did when confronted with something uncomfortable, when confronted with the truth of how the world worked. She, like everyone else, had seen the dynamic play out countless times before, but this time, she was a bit too slow to intervene, too uncertain to call out the obvious. "Of course," the woman said almost to herself. "Sorry, I misunderstood." Thompson could feel the frustration rising again, that hot flush of anger creeping into his chest, but he bit it back, swallowing it down. He couldn't afford to lose his composure. Not now, not in front of these people. He was a general. He had been trained to hold himself together under pressure. But this wasn't just about pressure. This was about how the world still saw him, how they would always see him, no matter what he accomplished, no matter how many accolades he received. "So, am I allowed to board now?" Thompson asked, his voice quieter, colder now. His tone wasn't confrontational. It didn't need to be. It was enough that his words carried the weight of everything he had been through in his life, everything he had fought for, and everything he had lost in order to get to this point. The words hung in the air, cold and final. Thompson's gaze was steady as he watched Karen's face, waiting for some kind of resolution, some sign that this madness would finally end. But there was no immediate answer. Karen's expression shifted just slightly. There was a flash of something in her eyes, something that seemed to flicker between frustration and uncertainty. She opened her mouth about to say something, but then stopped herself, looking at David, whose hands were now visibly trembling as he stood just behind her. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow, as if the entire airport terminal was holding its breath. Thompson's pulse was thundering in his ears, the anger boiling up again, pushing against his chest. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. It wasn't about a misunderstanding or some misplaced paperwork. It was about a system, a belief ingrained deep within the hearts of those who had the power to decide who belonged and who didn't. He could feel it. This wasn't a fluke, an isolated incident. This was a symptom of something much larger, a reflection of the prejudice that ran through the veins of society. They weren't just questioning his ticket. They were questioning his right to occupy space, his right to exist in a place of privilege, a place where people like him were never meant to be. The silence stretched on, unbearable, as the passengers around them continued to watch, waiting for something to break. Thompson could see the unease on their faces, the hesitation, the discomfort that rippled through the crowd. It was in the way they shifted in their seats, the way they exchanged furtive glances. Some of them looked away quickly, as though hoping they wouldn't be drawn into the scene. Others, though, seemed to take in every word, every motion, their expressions unreadable. Thompson could feel their eyes on him, heavy with expectation, with judgment. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice tight. "We can't just let you board, sir. We have to follow protocol." David shifted again, his eyes flicking nervously toward Karen, then to Thompson, his expression a mixture of guilt and fear. It was clear that he was uncomfortable, torn between his supervisor's demands and his own lingering doubts. Thompson knew what that look meant, the kind of hesitation that came when someone was unsure whether to back down or to dig in their heels. He had seen it before, in countless confrontations, in countless moments of tension. David wanted to do the right thing, but in this moment, he was caught in a system that didn't leave room for right or wrong. It left room only for compliance. Compliance with a system that kept people like Thompson at arm's length, kept them outside the circles of privilege and power. "This is ridiculous," Thompson muttered under his breath, the frustration that had been building inside him finally spilling out. His fingers tightened into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his mind racing with the weight of it all. Before anyone could respond, a voice from the back of the line cut through the air, a low, sharp bark that made everyone jump. "What's going on here?" The voice belonged to a man in his late 40s, well-dressed in a business suit, his expression one of barely contained irritation. He pushed through the crowd, approaching the counter with a stride that was both authoritative and impatient. Thompson didn't know this man, but the arrogance in his tone was unmistakable. He was the type who assumed his place in the world without question. Thompson looked back at the woman, the confusion still etched on her face, and then he saw it, the subtle flicker of realization in her eyes. She wasn't questioning the validity of the situation. She was just processing it, the way so many people did when confronted with something uncomfortable, when confronted with the truth of how the world worked. She, like everyone else, had seen the dynamic play out countless times before, but this time, she was a bit too slow to intervene, too uncertain to call out the obvious. "Of course," the woman said almost to herself. "Sorry, I misunderstood." Thompson could feel the frustration rising again, that hot flush of anger creeping into his chest, but he bit it back, swallowing it down. He couldn't afford to lose his composure. Not now, not in front of these people. He was a general. He had been trained to hold himself together under pressure. But this wasn't just about pressure. This was about how the world still saw him, how they would always see him, no matter what he accomplished, no matter how many accolades he received. "So, am I allowed to board now?" Thompson asked, his voice quieter, colder now. His tone wasn't confrontational. It didn't need to be. It was enough that his words carried the weight of everything he had been through in his life, everything he had fought for, and everything he had lost in order to get to this point. The words hung in the air, cold and final. Thompson's gaze was steady as he watched Karen's face, waiting for some kind of resolution, some sign that this madness would finally end. But there was no immediate answer. Karen's expression shifted just slightly. There was a flash of something in her eyes, something that seemed to flicker between frustration and uncertainty. She opened her mouth about to say something, but then stopped herself, looking at David, whose hands were now visibly trembling as he stood just behind her. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow, as if the entire airport terminal was holding its breath. Thompson's pulse was thundering in his ears, the anger boiling up again, pushing against his chest. This wasn't just about a seat on an airplane. It wasn't about a misunderstanding or some misplaced paperwork. It was about a system, a belief ingrained deep within the hearts of those who had the power to decide who belonged and who didn't. He could feel it. This wasn't a fluke, an isolated incident. This was a symptom of something much larger, a reflection of the prejudice that ran through the veins of society. They weren't just questioning his ticket. They were questioning his right to occupy space, his right to exist in a place of privilege, a place where people like him were never meant to be. The silence stretched on, unbearable, as the passengers around them continued to watch, waiting for something to break. Thompson could see the unease on their faces, the hesitation, the discomfort that rippled through the crowd. It was in the way they shifted in their seats, the way they exchanged furtive glances. Some of them looked away quickly, as though hoping they wouldn't be drawn into the scene. Others, though, seemed to take in every word, every motion, their expressions unreadable. Thompson could feel their eyes on him, heavy with expectation, with judgment. Finally, Karen spoke, her voice tight. "We can't just let you board, sir. We have to follow protocol." David shifted again, his eyes flicking nervously toward Karen, then to Thompson, his expression a mixture of guilt and fear. It was clear that he was uncomfortable, torn between his supervisor's demands and his own lingering doubts. Thompson knew what that look meant, the kind of hesitation that came when someone was unsure whether to back down or to dig in their heels. He had seen it before, in countless confrontations, in countless moments of tension. David wanted to do the right thing, but in this moment, he was caught in a system that didn't leave room for right or wrong. It left room only for compliance. Compliance with a system that kept people like Thompson at arm's length, kept them outside the circles of privilege and power. "This is ridiculous," Thompson muttered under his breath, the frustration that had been building inside him finally spilling out. His fingers tightened into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his mind racing with the weight of it all. Before anyone could respond, a voice from the back of the line cut through the air, a low, sharp bark that made everyone jump. "What's going on here?" The voice belonged to a man in his late 40s, well-dressed in a business suit, his expression one of barely contained irritation. He pushed through the crowd, approaching the counter with a stride that was both authoritative and impatient. Thompson didn't know this man, but the arrogance in his tone was unmistakable. He was the type who assumed his place in the world without question, someone who had never had to fight for what he wanted, never had to prove his worth. Thompson could see it in the way he held himself, in the casual entitlement with which he spoke. The man's eyes flicked over Thompson once, dismissively, before landing on Karen. "I've been waiting for over an hour," the man continued, his voice rising. "And now we have some kind of delay because of this? What's the holdup?" The immediate escalation of the situation shocked Thompson into stillness for a moment. The man had spoken to him as though he were nothing more than an inconvenience, a hurdle in his path. It was the kind of dehumanizing tone Thompson had heard too many times before. A tone that assumed that people like him weren't supposed to be in the same spaces as those with power. The insinuation was clear, and in that moment, the air around them seemed to thicken, the tension escalating from something personal to something systemic, something much larger. Karen stepped back, seemingly caught off guard by the man's sudden outburst. She quickly turned to David, her face a mask of professionalism, but the tension between them was undeniable. "I'm handling this, sir," she said, her voice strained. She gave the man a brief, apologetic smile, but it did little to quell his anger. Thompson's blood boiled. The man's entitlement, his disregard for the situation, it was the final straw. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension, calm but forceful. "The delay," he said, his words deliberate, "is because I've been singled out and questioned for no reason other than my skin color. And now you're trying to justify it. I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else. But for some reason that doesn't seem to be enough for you." The words landed like a punch, and for a moment, the man's face went blank. The words seemed to pierce through his entitlement, to disrupt the comfortable bubble he had created around himself. The air seemed to grow even heavier as the reality of the situation set in. The businessman's jaw tightened, and his eyes flicked to the others standing nearby, as though searching for support, looking for someone to agree with him. But no one spoke up. The silence was deafening, stretching out in all directions, punctuated only by the sound of distant footsteps and the hum of the terminal. There was a brief, pregnant pause. Then he spoke again, his voice tinged with defensiveness. "Listen, I don't know what your problem is, but I don't need to be involved in whatever this is," he said, glancing at Thompson with a sneer. He turned back to Karen, his tone shifting to one of cold authority. "Make sure this is taken care of. I'm not going to miss my flight over this." The words cut deep, sharper than anything Thompson had heard yet. The man wasn't interested in hearing him, wasn't interested in understanding the reality of what he had just said. All he wanted was for the situation to disappear, for it to be erased so that his world could remain undisturbed. But Thompson wasn't going to let that happen, not this time. He squared his shoulders, standing tall, refusing to let his presence be diminished. "The problem is that you and others like you assume that my place is elsewhere, that I don't belong here. I belong here. I earned this. I fought for this, and I will not be pushed aside by anyone." The words hit with such force that the crowd around them seemed to hold its collective breath. There was a shift in the energy in the terminal, a subtle but undeniable change. People who had been silently watching began to shift their weight, to look between the man and Thompson, some of them now uncomfortable, some of them staring openly at the businessman, as if the veil had been lifted and they saw him for what he was. A man who saw his privilege as his right to dictate who belonged and who didn't. The silence grew, deepening as Thompson's words echoed in the still air. Karen stood frozen, caught in the middle of the conflict, while David's face reddened with the weight of the accusation. The businessman, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, opened his mouth to speak again, but no words came. Instead, he glanced around, clearly looking for a way out. But in that moment, there was nowhere to go. And as the tension reached its peak, a small, quiet voice from the back of the terminal broke the silence. "Let him board," a woman said, her words clear, though soft. Her voice carried the weight of quiet defiance, and as it resonated in the hushed terminal, a ripple of agreement spread through the crowd. The world, for a moment, seemed to hold its breath. Thompson didn't move, but in that moment, he knew things had changed. The woman's voice hung in the air for a heartbeat, a quiet rebellion that seemed to ripple outward, spreading through the crowd like a slow-burning fire. For a moment, the terminal felt frozen in time, as though the entire world had stopped to watch and wait. Thompson stood there, his chest rising and falling with each breath, his gaze locked on Karen, David, and the businessman, all of them now silent, unwilling to make the next move. The tension was thick enough to taste, sharp like the metallic tang of fear in the air. And then, as if on cue, Karen broke the silence, her voice strained but resolute. "Fine," she said, the word hanging in the space between them. "You can board, but know this isn't over." She turned away from Thompson, her eyes flicking toward David and the other staff members, as if signaling for them to prepare for the next steps. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had just transpired, just an unspoken understanding that she was doing what she had to in order to move the situation forward. David, still standing behind the counter, seemed visibly relieved but unsure of what to do next. He glanced between Thompson and the businessman, his face flushed with discomfort, clearly torn by the conflict he'd witnessed. His hands fidgeted as he picked up a few stray papers on the counter, his eyes briefly meeting Thompson's before quickly darting away. He didn't say anything, but his silence spoke volumes, an admission of guilt, of complicity, perhaps even of recognition that he had been part of something far bigger than he was comfortable with. The businessman, on the other hand, wasn't as easily swayed, his face twisted with disdain, his lips pressing into a thin line as he regarded Thompson one last time. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, his tone barely audible but filled with venom. He turned sharply and walked away, clearly trying to maintain some semblance of control, but the power dynamic had already shifted. He couldn't deny it now. He knew it, and so did everyone who had witnessed the exchange. Thompson stood motionless, his mind racing as the adrenaline began to ebb away, leaving behind a sharp, hollow emptiness. The weight of the moment settled on him slowly, sinking into his bones like a cold fog. It wasn't just the humiliation he had felt, or the indignation of being profiled. It was everything. The silent judgments, the racial assumptions that had been placed upon him since the very moment he walked into the terminal, all of it came rushing back. He had always known on some level that this was the world he was fighting against, that this was the reality he would face no matter how many victories he earned, no matter how high he rose. As he stood there, waiting for the chaos to die down, his thoughts turned inward. It wasn't just about this moment, this airport, or even the fight for his seat. It was about the larger struggle for recognition, for equality, for respect. It was about every door that had ever been closed in his face, every glance that had turned away from him, every time he had been made to feel less than he was. His role as a general, the stripes on his uniform, none of it had protected him from the underlying prejudice that ran deep within society. But what could he do? He was trapped in a system that wasn't designed for him to succeed, a system that was built to break people like him down, to ensure that he never truly belonged. And yet here he was. He had fought for every inch, every step, and this was the price he paid for those battles. The constant, never-ending reminder that even the smallest victories would always come with a cost. The voices around him began to rise again, whispers echoing through the terminal as passengers slowly started to move. But the sense of unease remained, a low hum beneath the surface, like the quiet buzz of an electric wire waiting to snap. Then suddenly the sharp sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts. Thompson looked up, his gaze immediately shifting toward the entrance of the gate. A group of officers had entered the terminal, walking briskly through the doors with the unmistakable air of authority. There were 3 of them, their uniforms crisp, their eyes scanning the crowd as they moved with a clear purpose. They weren't here to defuse the situation. No, their arrival was a signal that things were about to escalate. The officers were quickly briefed by a flight attendant who had approached them, her words rapid, her gestures tense. Thompson could hear snippets of their conversation, their murmurs laced with confusion, disbelief, and suspicion. It seemed like the arrival of backup was more than just a precaution. They were here to deal with the aftermath of something they hadn't fully grasped. They hadn't seen the way the situation had been building, the quiet resentment that had been simmering just beneath the surface. One of the officers, a tall man with a square jaw and steely eyes, looked directly at Thompson. His gaze was colder than Thompson had expected, more clinical, as though he was already assessing him, measuring the situation in terms of protocol and procedure. "Is there a problem here?" the officer asked, his tone stiff. Thompson's stomach twisted. The words felt like a slap in the face. The officer hadn't even tried to understand the circumstances. He was already treating it like another disturbance to be handled, another case to be filed away. It wasn't a question of race, of dignity. It was a question of control, of maintaining order, even if it meant pushing people like Thompson into the shadows once more. Thompson opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a word out, the officer raised a hand, stopping him. "I need you to step aside, sir. We're going to handle this." Thompson's heart skipped a beat. The anger surged again, hot and sharp, threatening to spill over. He wasn't a child. He wasn't someone who needed to be handled, and yet that was the tone they took with him, authoritative, dismissive, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience, an obstacle to their day. He stepped back slightly, but his eyes never left the officer's face. "We've handled it," Thompson said, his voice low but clear. "You weren't here when this started, but now that you are, I suggest you take a good look at what's really going on here. Look at the people who have been watching this unfold. Look at the businessman who tried to push me aside. And then look at the system you're all a part of, the system that lets this happen." There was a long pause as the officer stared at him, his gaze flicking between Thompson's eyes and the ground, his lips pressed tight. The air grew thick again, the tension rising once more. It was as though Thompson's words had cracked something open, exposing the truth beneath the surface. The officer said nothing, but the silence spoke volumes. Behind him, the other officers were standing, still and watchful, their presence looming over the scene like an unspoken threat. The backup had arrived, but the chaos wasn't over. It had only just begun. Thompson stood there for a long moment, his mind racing as the officers continued to hover, the weight of their presence heavy in the air. His hands clenched into fists again, the anger still bubbling just beneath the surface, though now it was tempered by something else, something quieter, but stronger. A resolve had taken root within him, something deeper than just the desire to be left alone, to be treated fairly. He had been pushed to his limit, and for the first time in a long time, he realized that this fight wasn't just about him. It wasn't about getting back on a flight or about securing a seat in a first-class cabin. It was about something much bigger. It was about justice, about accountability, about forcing the people in power to see the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made them. The officers exchanged glances, their postures rigid, their conversations shifting from one of procedural detachment to something far more pointed. Thompson caught snippets of their dialogue, though it was mostly inaudible, drowned out by the hum of voices in the terminal. The tall officer with the square jaw seemed to be the one leading the discussion, speaking quietly to his colleagues. From the way they spoke, Thompson could hear the unspoken question lingering in the air. How did they handle this now? They had arrived too late to control the situation, to put the blame on him, to sweep it under the rug as a simple misunderstanding. The reality of the event, of his dignity being stripped away in front of so many people, was hanging between them now like an undeniable weight. Thompson could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, some of them still stunned, others filled with a sense of collective unease. He knew that things wouldn't just go back to normal after this. They couldn't. Not for him, and not for anyone who had witnessed the confrontation. He'd seen it, the discomfort in the way people shifted in their seats, how they exchanged glances when they thought no one was looking. They had seen what happened. They knew what had been done to him, and they knew that it had been wrong. That was the thing about moments like these. They had a way of peeling back the layers of illusion, of exposing the cracks in the system that were usually hidden beneath the surface. As the officers spoke among themselves, Thompson found his voice. "You can't just pretend this didn't happen," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "You can't just ignore it and move on. This isn't just a minor inconvenience or a one-time mistake. This is the reality of how people like me are treated every day. This is what it means to walk through life knowing that your worth is always being questioned, always being judged by people who don't know you, who don't care to know you. The officers shifted uncomfortably at his words, and for the first time, Thompson saw a crack in their armor. There was no immediate response, just the sound of their feet shuffling on the tile floor, as if they were uncertain of how to address the situation that had grown far larger than anticipated. "I didn't ask for this," Thompson continued, his voice rising slightly. "I didn't choose to be treated this way, but I'm not going to stand by and let this slide. Not now. Not ever again." The tall officer with the steely eyes finally spoke up, his voice firm but not unkind. "You're right," he said, his words carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "This shouldn't have happened. We should have handled things differently. But the way things went down, it's clear that there's a lot more at play here than we first realized. We're going to look into this, all of it." Thompson raised an eyebrow, skeptical but unwilling to dismiss the officer's words outright. "Look into it? What does that even mean? You're not just going to shuffle this under the rug, are you?" The officer met his gaze, his face serious. "Number, we're not going to sweep this away. We're going to investigate what happened, and we're going to take accountability. It's not just about you. It's about what's happening every day, all across the country. The way people are being mistreated, the way things like this are allowed to happen without consequences. We have to face the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us." There was a long pause as Thompson let the officer's words sink in. His stomach churned, but this time it wasn't with anger. It was something else, something closer to hope, or at least the idea that maybe, just maybe, things could change. He wasn't naive. He knew how the system worked, how slow and resistant to change it could be. But for the first time in his life, he was hearing someone with the power to make a difference acknowledge the problem out loud. Behind him, the flight attendant, who had originally tried to intervene, was speaking quietly to a supervisor, explaining what had transpired. Thompson could hear bits of the conversation, but he wasn't paying much attention anymore. He didn't need their explanations or justifications. What he needed was for them to understand that this wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't just about a bad experience at an airport or a miscommunication between passengers and staff. It was about a pattern, a systemic issue that affected every part of his life. From the way he was treated in everyday interactions, to the way he had to fight for every opportunity, every seat, every step forward. Thompson's mind wandered briefly to his past, the battles he had fought as a soldier, the endless obstacles he had faced in his career. He had worked so hard to get where he was, and yet time and time again, he had been forced to fight not just for respect, but for the simple right to be seen, to be heard. The uniform on his back should have been enough to earn him that. But in moments like this, it wasn't, and that reality stung deeper than any words ever could. "I'm not going to stop," he said, more to himself than anyone else, but loud enough that the officers could hear him. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't just fade into the background. People need to know what happened here. People need to understand that this kind of thing has to end." The officer who had spoken earlier nodded slowly. "We'll do what we can to make sure this is handled properly. We're going to bring in the right people, investigators, higher-ups. This goes beyond just you and me. This is about accountability, and we're going to make sure that everyone involved is held responsible. It's time we face the truth." Thompson didn't smile. There was no relief in the officer's words, no promise of an easy resolution, but there was something in the air now, something palpable, like the first gust of wind before a storm. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time in years, Thompson felt the faintest glimmer of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning. The terminal was quieter now, the clamor of voices and the hum of activity dulled by the gravity of what had transpired. The officers had left, their departure a sign that things were moving forward, albeit slowly. Thompson stood alone, his eyes fixed on the spot where the businessman had once stood, where the fight had started. The space around him felt different now, as if the very air had shifted, charged with the weight of the moment. It wasn't just the physical emptiness that had settled over the terminal. It was the emotional silence that had followed. The collective understanding that something had been broken open, something had been exposed that could no longer be ignored. Thompson's fingers brushed the edge of his uniform, his thoughts drifting. He had walked into that terminal an hour ago, just trying to get to his destination, unaware that a much larger battle awaited him. He had been caught in the crosshairs of a system that had long sought to keep people like him in their place, to push them aside with little more than a glance that told him everything he needed to know about the prejudices woven into the fabric of everyday life. But what had happened in those moments, what had unfolded before the eyes of the passengers and the staff, wasn't just a personal affront. It was a reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. It was a fight that had been going on for centuries, in boardrooms, in classrooms, in neighborhoods and airports just like this one. Thompson had spent his life fighting battles of a different kind, but this fight, the one for equality, for respect, for recognition, was one that required every ounce of his strength and resolve. The frustration, the anger, the exhaustion, it was all still there, deep within him, simmering beneath the surface. But it was no longer enough to simply feel it. He had to act. He had to make sure this moment, this incident, was part of a much larger conversation, one that stretched far beyond the walls of this airport, beyond the confines of his own experience. This was about more than just him. This was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or less than because of their skin color. It was about their voices, their stories, their right to live with dignity. As he stood there, watching the passengers begin to board their flights, the pang of exhaustion hit him once more. But so did something else, something softer, quieter, but just as potent. Hope. Hope that change could come, not just through the work of those in power, but through the collective strength of those who refuse to remain silent, who refuse to let these injustices go unchecked. Hope that the conversations sparked by moments like these could grow into something larger, something that rippled out and created lasting change. Thompson wasn't under any illusion that the road ahead would be easy. He knew that facing the entrenched systems of racism and injustice would be a long, difficult journey. There would be setbacks and there would be moments of doubt. But in that moment, standing in the wake of what had happened, he understood that his voice, his actions mattered. They were part of a larger movement, one that had been building for generations, one that would continue to build with each new injustice that was exposed, each new battle that was fought. He took a deep breath, squarely facing the challenges ahead. He had made it this far. He had fought for every inch of ground, and he wasn't about to stop now. The world needed to know that things couldn't stay the same, that people like him, people who had been so often overlooked and dismissed, would no longer allow themselves to be silenced. They would rise up and they would demand their place in the world. As Thompson walked toward the gate, the weight of his uniform heavy on his shoulders, he didn't feel defeated. He didn't feel broken. He felt ready, ready to continue the fight not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been denied their right to live with dignity, respect, and equality. The struggle wasn't over, but there was a fire inside him now, a fire that would keep burning until the day he saw real change, until the day the world finally began to see what had been invisible for so long, until the day the fight against injustice was no longer a battle, but a movement, one that could never be silenced.